Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome back historian Leigh Wakefield to the show to talk about Portrayals of Mary, Queen of Scots. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome back to Talking Tudors, Leigh. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Natalie. It's great to be back. Thank you so much for having me back on your podcast.
Yes, I've been so looking forward to speaking to you again because I so enjoyed our last conversation. So before we get into the subject of today's podcast, could you just introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yes, of course. My name is Leigh Wakefield. You may have come across me on my Instagram page, Historically Speaking. That's where I share all little snippets of my love of history, as well as talk a little bit about my job at Hampton Court Palace. Lovely place to work. I've recently completed my history MA at the University of Winchester, and waffled on about in the previous podcast I did with you. It focused all on Catherine Howard and how modern feminism has impacted popular portrayals of her. I was going to focus on Mary, Queen of Scots as well, but unfortunately, due to the word count, I had to cut her out. But yeah, I did a lot of research into her, and so yeah, she was a big part of my insights into how feminism has impacted historical women in today's world. So yeah, that is a little insight into into my background.
Wonderful. And yes, we did talk about Catherine Howard last time around. So, and you had mentioned in that podcast episode that you had gathered lots of information about Mary, Queen of Scots, and that you were really interested in her life as well. So I said, well, come back and let's talk about Mary, Queen of Scots. So here we are. So when did you first become interested in Mary, Queen of Scots' life? And what do you think makes her story so fascinating?
So I'd always been aware of Mary, Queen of Scots. As a big Tudor fan, she had always been kind of on the periphery of my awareness. However, I had learned and read a lot about her through her rival, Elizabeth I. And that, as many of your listeners, I'm sure, are aware, that does offer a rather tainted insight into her story because they are notorious rivals, as you could say. I had read a few biographies exclusively of Mary, yet I ashamedly had fell for the narrative that Mary was the failed queen, in inverted commas, who didn't inspire me as much as some of her other contemporaries, female contemporaries. She had appeared to enjoy this luxurious and pampered lifestyle in France, which supposedly made her an ineffective and ill-prepared queen when she returned to Scotland, and she struggled to rule over her courtiers and favoured inappropriate men, which eventually led to her abdication, imprisonment in England, and execution. So in comparison, as I say, to Elizabeth I, who is widely celebrated as this successful queen, contemporary in Mary Queen of Scots was sadly lacking in my say teenage mind. And I think as well, actually, feminism had a lot to do with that, because we are still living in an age where we celebrate independent, forthright women who go against the traditional patriarchal society. And Elizabeth definitely symbolizes that for a lot of women today. And Mary, as I said, almost the complete opposite in a lot of historical narratives. So it wasn't until I started reading very recent biographies of Mary, as well as a few screen adaptations of her, that my attitude began to change. And I began to see her in a more positive light. And I wanted to, when I started doing my dissertation, I wanted to see why that was the case. Why is my attitude changing towards, what has caused that change? And is it changing other people's perception of her as well? And I think I always from the beginning kind of knew that it was feminist influences having an effect. So I kind of wanted to understand what brought about this change, a bit like with Catherine Howard, what has brought about the change in the narrative. And with Mary, it was exclusively focusing on her third marriage to Bothwell, because that was, fundamental, I think, to understanding why she ended up fleeing into England and why it all gone so badly wrong for her, and where a lot of the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes regarding her abilities as queen and her femininity and her sexuality had become very controversial. It all centers around that one moment in her life where she marries Bothwell. And I really wanted to understand a bit more about that, and as I say, why the narrative was changing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I think the research you're doing on so many different levels, I think it's so interesting to look at these stories and to try and pinpoint where they originate, because it does tell us so much about the societies that created them, more so, I think, than the actual person they're describing most of the time. So I think it's really fascinating. And of course, you've been looking at Mary's portrayal in film, novels, TV, lots of different media. So can you tell us a little bit about how she's been traditionally, and you've given us some hints there, how she's been traditionally portrayed on film, and maybe give us some examples if you've got them to hand as well?
Yes, of course. So yeah, as I said in the episode with Catherine Howard, I was so lucky with my research that I had to focus on a lot of films and TV. It was the best research I think I'll ever do. Yes, and Mary has often, especially in films or novels that are centered around her story, she has often been portrayed as this tragic, romantic heroine who was often denied a happy marriage. So her second marriage to Lord Darnley, renowned for being a disaster, basically. So in a lot of early 20th century films, especially, we have Mary of Scotland. I think it's 1936 that came out. She is seen to be suffering in this disastrous marriage to Lord Darnley, and the swaggering, very masculine Earl Bothwell comes in and saves the day. The audience are encouraged to almost cheer Mary on as she attempts to marry Bothwell, the love of her life, against all the odds, even appearing to risk life itself to be together. And the Scottish nobleman and the politics of the age, and even Elizabeth I herself, is seen to be these evil, almost obstacles to Mary and Bothwell's love story, which takes away, for anyone who knows, I've done some research into the real Mary Queen of Scots, will know that she claimed that she was attacked by Bothwell, which compelled her to marry him eventually, to kind of, in an attempt to save her reputation. She had to marry him. She felt compelled to marry him, even though he'd done this awful thing to her. So the films and the novels that dominated the early 20th century completely ignored Mary's claims regarding Bothwell, to present this love-struck woman who was in love, as I say, with this almost heroic, chivalric Bothwell, and very much fed into the contemporary belief that women should be ultra feminine, should be very submissive and obedient to the men in their lives. It was Elizabeth, with her single status and her virginity and her very masculine way of ruling, was seen as a little bit of an oddity. She went against nature almost. So Mary, at this time, supposedly romantic liaison, was actually quite celebrated. and yeah, Margaret George and Margaret Owen as well have followed on to this theme of presenting Mary and Bothwell as this historical tragic love story. And yeah, I did find when I was researching a lot of this that it did deprive Mary of agency a lot of the time, because she, whenever she was in distress, so whenever you watch the 1936 Mary of Scotland, you'll see that if ever Mary feels threatened, or say if she starts to crumble because John Knox has been very forceful in his religion and tearing her down, and the male courtiers have also given her a hard time, or Elizabeth is giving her a hard time. Whenever she seems to be in distress, it's always Bothwell that comes along and rescues her. And Mary is not shown to have any, I say, agency or any ability to look after herself and rule as a queen in her own right and rule as an effective queen. It's always Bothwell that will come in and look after her and save the day. So it's a very Disneyfied version of events with regards to Mary. And that's what I found, that she was always portrayed as a lovesick queen in need of protection. That almost fed in a little bit with the ideal female figure of the 20th century. The 1960s did see a slight change with Antonia Fraser's biography, which again, I'm sure many of your listeners will know because it is an iconic biography in the Tudor world and Mary Queen of Scots. It was renowned for being the first feminist biography. So I was really intrigued to read that again, because I'd only read it when I was a teenager. So I don't think I really fully appreciated how unique it was. So I was really excited to read it again. Yeah, I was actually slightly disappointed, because even though Antonia Fraser admits that Mary was unfortunately attacked by Bothwell and abused by him, she goes on to say that she was too weak to fight against it, that she would have been aware of his attempts to abduct her, take her to his stronghold and do this awful thing to her. And she was aware of it, but she was too weak to fight against it. She was a hopeless damsel in distress, and again, deprives her of agency, which I was quite surprised at. And also John Guy, in his 2004 biography, again, it was hailed for being a very sympathetic portrayal of Mary Queen of Scots. And largely I do agree, but when it came to the chapter which focused on Mary and Bothwell's relationship, again, it was very unsympathetic. It went against a lot of current feminist discussions regarding rape culture. It was just, it was very shocking, because I think John Guy says in his book that Mary, even though she was attacked by Bothwell and was dominated by him, and he was very brutal towards her, he will then go on to say that she appeared to welcome a subordinate role, and that she was a fool for love. This was evident by the fact that she didn't try to escape his clutches, that she just willingly stayed with him and was devastated when became obvious to her that Bothwell didn't love her in return. So it goes against current feminist talks regarding how women, like victims and perpetrators, behave during these awful, awful relationships and very toxic scenarios. So I was quite shocked at how unforgiving of the time some of these sympathetic historians towards Mary had been towards her in her third marriage. I was very shocked by it.
Yeah, and I think even still today, you hear a lot of that sort of talk about Mary, especially, as you say, with relationship with Bothwell, which is it's quite shocking, isn't it? And so are there any portrayals then, Leigh, that actually challenge any of those myths that you know of, or are they all sort of consolidating that narrative?
So again, it's similar to the Catherine Howard historiography when it comes to popular portrayals. It's only been very recently, I would argue, that there has been a change in the narrative of how Mary's relationships has been portrayed. And people might differ, but argue against it. But I think it has a lot to do with the Me Too movement. Again, very similar to Catherine Howard. I think the Me Too movement and its fight against, or trying to raise awareness with the reality regarding sexual abuse and harassment, coincided, I think, with a few representations of Mary coming out. It aligned very much with the Me Too rhetoric. So the biggest one for me was the one that really changed my perception of Mary for the better. It was really like a watershed moment for me. It was Kate Williams' book, Rival Queens. Again, a few of your listeners might have read it as well. It was the first encounter for me of a representation of Mary that was very much, it was definitely more of a sympathetic, more understanding portrayal. Kate had openly applied Me Too discussions into her research and into her findings when she was talking about Bothwell and the fact that a lot of historians had criticized Mary for not trying to flee, not trying to escape, not trying to fight against him. That was really eye-opening, trying to get into the mindset of a victim of this horrible abuse and saying that, if this was almost saying, if this was you going through this horrible thing, would you do that the same way? Yeah, it really did challenge the negative assumptions around Mary in a way that I had never encountered before. And I think even when I was researching my dissertation and researching Mary, that was for me still the first time that someone had openly applied feminism to Mary's story and said this is very, very relevant. And it completely changes your perception of her. She's no longer then this ineffective queen who rules with her heart over her head. It is very much a woman who was in these tragic circumstances. You were put in a lot of situations against her will, which was really, as I say, really illuminating. And following on from that, even though it wasn't always historically accurate, was the 2018 Mary Queen of Scots with Saoirse Ronan and Margot Robbie. That was, definitely. If ever you were to Google that film or Google that with feminism or etc. whatever, you would come across loads of articles, loads of film reviews that openly associate that film with feminism. It was very openly feminist. The director, Jodie O'Rourke, but she is very openly saying that she was influenced by modern day feminism. She wanted to use it to portray Mary in a very feminist light. So again, you will see that she was forced to marry Bothwell against her will. It was never something she was openly or willingly wanting to do. It shows how a lot of the forces in a patriarchal, misogynistic society were against her. And these two sources, so Kate Williams, her book, and Mary Queen of Scots, the film, it was the first time that people had taken Mary's story at face value, had taken her accusations and her claims and allegations at face value, and had not used the word of her enemies over that of her own. And I thought that was actually quite a momentous moment in her history.
And so you've obviously talked about the fact that you do believe the Me Too movement and modern feminism, just like with Catherine Howard, has in fact impacted the representation, although, as you've said, only really quite recently in fiction and film. So I know that another part of your research, Leigh, was to kind of look at online responses, which I also found so interesting when we were talking about Catherine Howard. So did you get to do that with Mary Queen of Scots, and what have you found has been the kind of reaction to this reinterpretation of Mary as something other than just this, Victorian hapless victim?
Yes, I did. And this is what I found fascinating, actually, because with Catherine Howard, it was overly welcoming. A lot of people had embraced this new vision of Catherine Howard, this new interpretation of Catherine Howard as a victim, or almost, I don't want to say an icon, but a figure that represented the Me Too movement in the Tudor era. With Mary, it was definitely more of a division amongst audiences regarding whether people embraced this new interpretation of her or not. When I was researching online responses to this new portrayal of Mary Queen of Scots in film and books and whatever, there appeared to be a lingering criticism regarding her sexuality, personality, and legacy, ultimately. Many commentators still viewed her as impulsive when it came to her marriages, despite the newfound arguments in the wake of Me Too. She was still accused of not being very smart, and whether she was a victim or not, she was still perceived as to be weak and ineffectual when it came to her, in inverted commas, her terrible taste in men. There was a growing belief that she was indeed a victim of abuse and manipulation, which was a result of these new representations of her. But yeah, I was quite surprised to see that there was still a lot of negative feedback regarding her reputation. And I was, if I'd have included Mary in my dissertation, I probably would have delved into the reasons why that is a bit more. So unfortunately, I didn't have time to really delve into it. But I think when I was looking into it a little bit, I think it's to do with the fact that if you were to compare Mary and Catherine Howard, you've got Catherine Howard, who was very young. She was notorious for being very, very young when she died, and Mary was a lot older. So I think there's not the excuse of the youthful card to say that, Mary was too young to know what she was doing. I think there's also the difference in status. You have Mary, who was always known that she was going to be queen. She was queen in her own right. She was given this opportunity to really show critics that women could rule. And I think a lot of people still blame her for ruining it. She ruined this opportunity where Elizabeth thrived and really showed the world that women could be successful monarchs. Mary had failed. And I think there is still this lingering resentment to that. Meanwhile, Catherine Howard was never intended to be queen. She never would have known that she would be, Henry VIII's wife. So how can you blame her for acting and behaving in a way that she would have known would come to bite her on the bum eventually? I think Mary doesn't have that. I say excuse, but she doesn't have that. And so I think that's why you still got this, as I say, this lingering criticism amongst viewers and audiences. There's still this disappointment almost, even though it's completely, if you were to take Mary's word and take her allegations at face value, it's completely unfounded. You can't blame someone you can't victim shame someone for going through this awful thing that affected their life in such a damaging way. But a lot of people still do. And I think it's, as I say, this disappointment that this woman had this wonderful opportunity like Elizabeth, and she failed in their eyes. And I think that would take a lot longer to replace. I think that would take a lot longer to go.
Yeah, there's such good points. I completely agree with you. I think with Catherine Howard, people do see her as vulnerable, and of course her youthfulness, her age. There's that kind of feeling a little bit sorry for her that perhaps she didn't know what she was getting into and catapulted into the Tudor court, whereas Mary, as you say, was raised to be queen from very, very, very little, and of course was given this incredible education and had such powerful women as role models around. So I see what you're saying, that people kind of think she should have done more with the opportunities. But it's interesting, isn't it? Do you think it also has, because I often wonder at the lack of compassion for Mary, which I find quite astounding as well. Do you think it might have something to do as well with that fact that she is so often sort of pitted against Elizabeth I, who of course has a huge following, a huge fan club, and that in a way kind of makes it more difficult for Mary to come out of this kind of traditional narrative as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think if Mary didn't live in the same time in the same island with Elizabeth I, we will not be having this discussion today. I think she would be very much embraced, the same as Catherine Howard, as as a potential Me Too figure. It's really unfortunate for Mary that she is always pitted against Elizabeth, which again, the feminist movement was trying to eradicate that, because they wanted, a lot of feminist activists aim to have a united sisterhood where the media and society are no longer pitting women against each other. But unfortunately, when it comes to Elizabeth and Mary, that is still ongoing. That is still ongoing today. Elizabeth she's almost got these masculine qualities, which before were almost rejected in the Victorian age in the early 20th century. As I said earlier, it went against the social values of traditional femininity that was praised at the time. Meanwhile, today, that as you said, she has got such a huge following because of her independence, her ability to rule in her own way and to succeed and champion over all these men. And it was just, there's so many people who are rightfully in awe of Elizabeth I. Meanwhile, Mary is still and has largely been portrayed as this feminine character, which is largely associated with weakness, impulsiveness, desirability, submissiveness. Yeah, and a lot of those stereotypes still cling to her reputation. When it comes to popular representations of them, because this has definitely cemented that legacy of Elizabeth and Mary. If you look at books or films that focus exclusively on Elizabeth, for example, again, they celebrate her independence, her virginity, her ability to rule alone. They focus a lot more on the politics and the religious aspects of Elizabeth's reign, as well as the threats that she had to overcome. So they further that positive legacy. Her love life does feature, but it doesn't dominate the narrative at all. It rather portrays an Elizabeth who focused and favoured her throne and the needs of her people. So it's always a bit of a martyrdom to her.
Yeah.
She, was very was very unselfish in the fact that she, people's needs before her own. So that's why she remained single. So yeah, as I say, her love life definitely takes a bit more of a back seat when it comes to films of her life or her novels focusing on her life. Her appearance and sexuality is also just briefly touched upon. She is regularly shown lording over bright, impressive, courtly scenes and dressed in these magnificent regal clothes and just looks fabulous in every way. And her sexuality is, like I said, barely touched upon. Viewers are not encouraged to really think about that. They are meant to see this woman who is in charge, in power. When it comes to representations of Mary, unfortunately, if she's featured in a biopic of Elizabeth, she's often depicted as evil or the impassioned queen. She's often in hysterics. She can be in these really dark rooms. In contrast to Elizabeth, it's definitely light and dark. And again, it will focus on the fact that Mary let her heart rule her head and Elizabeth didn't. If you look at films that focus exclusively on Mary, they can be, as I say, more romantic. They do again focus on her appearance and her desirability. That features a lot more than they do in Elizabeth's own films. They highlight Mary's ability to charm men, and she features in many more bedroom scenes than Elizabeth ever does. Love life dominates the narrative, sometimes to the detriment of her achievements as queen, which can be barely touched upon. A lot of her romantic relationships, as I say, dominate the storyline. And even if her achievements are included, as I said before, they are often a result of male interference. So Bothwell would have come in and saved the day. Mary did manage to silence John Knox, but that's only because Bothwell came in and saved her and took her away. Darnley was put in his place, but that's only because the Earl of Moray, her half brother, came in and saved the day. So she did have some elements of her story to celebrate, but it was a result of male interaction. And if they tried to present Mary in a sympathetic light, as I say, her sexuality, her youth, her attractiveness are favoured. So you're meant to celebrate Mary as a romantic heroine, not because she was a capable queen in contrast to Elizabeth. So yeah, even if you're trying to be sympathetic, it's still doing Mary a huge disservice. So yeah, it's really fascinating how these two women are, like I say, always continuously pitted against each other. The Mary Queen of Scots film in 2018, they tried to change that. I believe they tried to show that both Mary and Elizabeth were both flawed. They both had good qualities. They both felt vulnerable and they both felt empowered. But reading again a few of the reactions that audiences had to that film, there was still this feeling of favoritism towards Elizabeth or favoritism towards Mary with regards to she never aged. Mary never aged. She was always beautiful and youthful. Elizabeth had, more hysterical, and it was really quite interesting how people reacted to this attempt to try and equalize the two women. But ultimately it still didn't work. People still thought that there was, favoritism one over the other. It was quite interesting researching that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm just thinking, of course, with Mary, as in Elizabeth's half sister, Mary the First. It's the same sort of thing, isn't it? Although Mary obviously has a shorter time on the throne, but it's like she can never quite come out of the shadow of Elizabeth. It just I think people again compare them, fail to see Mary the First's qualities as well. And again, that whole storyline of Mary in the end wanted to marry, didn't she? She wanted to marry Philip. She was quite enthusiastic about it. And it's almost as though, yes, Elizabeth sacrificed her happiness and her the natural order of things, which should have been mother and, wife, in order to be the mother of her people. So it's so interesting how it works with Mary, her sister, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And Mary the First and Mary Queen of Scots, they didn't do anything that was surprising.
No.
I sometimes think if I was in her situation, you had that social pressure to be a woman, to marry, to have children, you probably would go for it. You probably would go along with it because that's what you would have thought your subjects expected of you. Your subjects expected you to marry, to produce an heir, to ensure the succession of your dynasty. They didn't do anything particularly wrong. It was just actually, a lot of the time it was the men that were involved that that ended up causing a lot of problems for them. But yeah, it is really, as you say, when you really sit and think about it, you do think, are the contemporary criticisms and very sexist criticisms of Mary, the Marys, and Elizabeth. They're still with us today.
Oh, yeah.
And you've got to kind of be really critical of yourself and think, am I still harboring these quite old-fashioned, criticisms and stereotypes around them? And I would, as I said, when I first started researching this, I realized for a long time I did harbor a lot of very traditional views towards Mary, which I don't agree with now. I'm not saying that she was this saint and, she was a victim and we should always, make excuses for her. I'm not saying that at all, but it definitely, by accepting her word and what she said happened to her and the natural and very understandable consequences of that, it does change your perception of her. It does change that. And when it comes to Elizabeth and the fact that we do obviously celebrate and praise her for ruling alone and in a man's world. When people ask, do you think Elizabeth was truly a virgin queen? And I do sometimes get a bit annoyed at that because I think, does it matter?
Yeah.
Does it matter if she was? Would you think any less of her if she wasn't actually the virgin queen? If she did act on her desires, would you think in the long grand scheme of things, would you think any less of her? But people will still, they will still rate her with regards to whether they think that she was, a truly pure woman or they will praise her solely because she didn't marry. And I think there'd be so many other things that we could praise her for. And again, there's so many other things to Mary we can praise her for, regardless of her marriages. But that's what, when it comes to women, that's what a lot of people focus on is their romantic history.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, which is a bit sad, isn't it? That some people are still peddling the same things men were in the 16th century, which is kind of shocking. But I don't know if you've read Captive Queen, Leigh. Have you read that by Dr. Jade Scott?
I'm reading it now.
Are you? I was just going to say, because I really loved that book because I think what it does is shows both sides. It shows the fantastic qualities that Mary had, and it also shows that she was human, like all of us. And I think what it does really well so it's basically, it's not really a full biography, but it's painting the picture of Mary's life during captivity in England, and it focuses heavily on her own correspondence, which is so brilliant because so often we hear about women through some man's opinion or voice. So this is really, we're hearing a lot in Mary's voice. And I just thought it was really interesting how it shows her as really politically savvy and making decisions and responding to things that are happening in her life and having that agency that you were talking about. So I just thought I'd mention it because I really, really enjoyed that one. I would really recommend it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm really enjoying reading this. So if anyone's listening and they think about reading this book or you see it, please read it. It's so good. And shout out to Jade Scott. It's fabulous. Well done. Yes. And also Linda Porter's perception of Mary. I think she did a podcast with you previously where she talked about Mary, Queen of Scots. And I listened to that during my research, and that was also really eye-opening. And I think Linda's insights into Mary and how she's been perceived over the years is really extraordinary as well. And so, definitely listen to that episode of you as well. But it's really nice. It's really refreshing to see these historians coming out and taking on board the view of Mary as so much more than the wife, than with the dastardly husbands. It's really nice to see that they are focusing on her abilities as a queen, as a monarch, as someone who was politically aware, really well educated. And even though she was again acting against Elizabeth during her imprisonment, you do read it and you go, well, fair play.
Yeah.
She's, I mean, I love Elizabeth. I'm so glad that she ruled successfully. But if I sometimes think, she didn't always treat Mary well. I know it was in a very unique situation, but if you'd been in prison for 19 years when you knew that you were meant to be queen since birth, you would fight against it. And I think it's quite empowering that Mary was always fighting. She was always fighting for her place in society. And I think we can only admire that.
Yeah, I have to say I was quite exhausted by the end of Dr. Scott's book because that level of fight and continuous fight, I just thought, wow, that takes a lot of courage and energy. And when you're imprisoned it's quite amazing. So I highly recommend it. And I'm so glad you mentioned Dr. Linda Porter as well, because I was actually thinking while you were talking that there are so many parallels between Mary, Queen of Scots, and how she's viewed and portrayed, and how Margaret Tudor, her grandmother, right? I think, yes, Margaret Tudor, as in Henry VIII's sister. So many connections. How she's also portrayed. And of course, Linda has written an excellent biography on Margaret Tudor, where she's showing what a careful queen she was as well, and dispelling some of those myths about the choices in men, here we go again, that Margaret made and the marriages that she made. And it's so interesting. And of course, goes into that sibling rivalry with Henry VIII, which is absolutely fascinating. So another book to add to your list, everyone, if you're listening, put it on your TBR list. So it is, you're right. Yeah. It is refreshing to see that we are looking at these women with fresh eyes, or at least trying to understand them in the context that they lived. And I think that's really key as well.
Absolutely. And it can really transform the narrative around them. Because I always think, if you were to be remembered in 500 years' time, I don't think I would want to be remembered for my relationship history. I wouldn't want to be defined by that. But yeah, a lot of these women are, and as I say, Margaret Tudor is another one. But when you read their stories, you realise that there is so much more to them, and there's so much more that we can respect and admire and be inspired by. So it's not just Elizabeth. You have to move. Elizabeth's got to make room for all these other women now. They're coming.
I don't know how she'd feel about that, Leigh, making room for any other woman. To be honest with you.
I know. I think I can feel her looking down at me now, thinking, can you please be quiet? I still like Elizabeth, I promise.
Well, I have one more question for you, and that is I'm just curious to know what aspects then of Mary's life and of her personality would you like to see brought forward, or a spotlight shone on, or depicted more in films and in fiction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, again, it will hark back to what we said earlier about, please, I'd love to see more about how she dealt with the male courtiers in her court. I think I'd love to see actually a bit more of her interactions with, like, it sounds quite boring. I know it doesn't sound like good entertainment, but the way she handled the religious division in Scotland at the time. You had people like John Knox, who was really shoving down her throat the Protestant faith, and she held her ground, and she was really quite tolerant for her age, for her time. And I thought that was quite remarkable in this age that is defined by religious conflict. She held her own really well, and her personal reign in Scotland was actually remarkably peaceful, remarkably smooth. When you think that she didn't grow up in Scotland, she came back to Scotland without really knowing her own country after spending so many years in France. So, that's something to applaud. I think that was quite remarkable. Relationships with other women, so regards to Elizabeth, but also Catherine de Medici, all these amazing women that she sometimes butted heads with or had these amazing interactions with. I think that would be something that would be great to highlight. And as we said with Jade Scott's book as well, focusing on, because Mary's had such an extraordinary life. You could pick her childhood in France, pick her time in Scotland, and that would be a film in itself. You just can't. And Jade Scott's focused on her imprisonment and how much we can learn just from that one chapter alone, and that can shed light on so much about Mary's personality and agency without any men involved, any of her husbands involved. I think that's quite remarkable. So definitely, I think we're heading in the right direction, because there's definitely more out there that seems to appeal to more than just Mary's, let's say, inverted commas, failures and her romantic history. And also just taking her word at face value, rather than overpowering her own voice with that other enemies, is really refreshing. Same as Catherine Howard. We're now starting to, we don't know what happened. We weren't there, but it might not have happened the way they said it did. But just actually taking the voices of these women and taking them for granted over, you still consider what her enemies said, but, still include their version of events. I think that is the right way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes there's a tendency for people to think that when you are looking at a story again with fresh eyes, or, from a different perspective, that you're somehow trying to paint them as a saint, but it's nothing to do with that, is it? It's more just wanting to do them justice and wanting to create something more akin to the actual human, a more nuanced, complex person. This happens a lot of the time, unfortunately, with Anne Boleyn, who is the woman I study, and often people will say, you think she's a saint. No, I don't actually. I don't
No?
at all think she's a saint. She's like on the opposite end of the spectrum, and
Yeah.
that's what I love, that she is human, that we can relate to her, that she had good days, good decisions, bad decisions. Yeah. And I think looking closely at the stories that were told about them and interrogating those sources and trying to find out the motivations of the people that wrote them and all of that is just to do her justice, not to paint her as a saint because she wasn't one. Is anybody a saint? I
Yeah.
don't know. So it's interesting how there is that tendency for people to think, oh no, look, this is a skewed story or something, where really we're just trying to make the story as, I don't know, real as possible, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with you. They're definitely not two-dimensional characters.
Yeah.
It's not good or bad. It's not a Disney version of the past. As you say, there are a lot. They're very multi-dimensional. There's a lot of aspects going on, and especially when you look at people like Anne Boleyn or Mary, Queen of Scots, when you're also faced with quite traumatic moments in your life. I don't think any of us can say that we'll behave in the correct way, or what you would think would be the correct way to handle it. If you're dealing with something that's quite terrifying or quite traumatic or very pressurized, you've got to sit back and think, well, how would we react?
Yeah.
And I think that, these women, they handled certain situations in this very unforgiving society very well, even if we don't agree with I think, their strength. It says a lot that we still remember them today and we still talk about them, because obviously their strength, or there's something about their character. There's some quality about them that we still hark back to. And so it's definitely not a very romantic version of them, and saying that they're purely saints, they did nothing wrong. It's definitely not like that at all. But I hope people take that on board.
Yeah, I hope so too. And the very last thing, Leigh, is the Tudor takeaway. So something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
Yeah. So mine is also another book that I mentioned earlier. It's Kate Williams' Rival Queens. I know a lot of you probably have read it already, but if you haven't, please do. For me, it was a watershed moment with my interactions, my relationship with Mary Queen of Scots, that changed my view of her and actually inspired my dissertation as a whole, because it stuck with me. It stuck with me for so many years, and that's what inspired the dissertation. So it seems a shame that I didn't include Mary in the end in my dissertation. But I definitely would say go and read that book, because it really does symbolize and represent how feminism can help, or can impact our perception of historical women and the past. So even if you don't agree with it, if you don't agree with Kate Williams' findings, just still I think I still like people to read it and appreciate how our modern thought can, shed insight if we use it effectively.
Oh, what a wonderful takeaway. Thank you so much. And it's been such a pleasure chatting with you as always. And I highly recommend as well that people follow your Historically Speaking on Instagram, because you always have such great posts and insights. Plus, of course, few behind the scenes photos of Hampton Court, which is never an issue. I love seeing, although I get a bit jealous that I'm not there with you when you're working. But Leigh, thank you so much for joining us again on Talking Tudors.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be back. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.